Tokuda stood at the edge of the mesa, his eyes closed against the harsh Arizona sun. The land stretched before him, cracked red and unforgiving. His people called this place the land of standing rocks, where ancestors whispered through wind. Stone. 5 summers had passed since the last of his band had scattered to the reservation or the grave. 5 summers since he buried his grandfather and chosen the path of the drifter, neither fully of the white man's world nor his own. The wind changed. It always did before sunset, but this shift carried something different. A sound thin and wavering like a child's reed flute. Not natural, not animal. Tokuda's eyes snapped open, dark irises reflecting the crimson horizon. "Grandfather," he whispered, though he knew better. The dead didn't speak, not even here where the veil felt thin. He adjusted the Winchester rifle slung across his back, its weight a constant reminder of his compromise with the new world. His grandfather would have carried a bow until his final day, but Tokuda had survived the massacre at Black Mesa because of this rifle, this tool of the invaders. The irony hadn't escaped him. The sound came again, louder, a calling. His fingers absently traced the scar on his forearm, 3 wavy lines, intersected by a perfect circle. The mark his grandfather had carved into him during his vision quest at 16. The mark that meant protector, watcher, the one who stands between. "I have protected nothing," he said to the emptiness. His band was gone, his grandfather's wisdom buried with him. What remained were fragments, half-remembered ceremonies, stories told around fires that no longer burned. The cry on the wind persisted, pulling west toward the trading settlement the whites called Redemption, a place Tokuda avoided. 20 buildings of weathered pine and desperate hopes, where miners, ranchers, and those running from something gathered to trade, drink, and pretend the desert wasn't slowly reclaiming everything they built. His Epona, named for a goddess from a book a missionary had once given him, shifted nervously beneath the juniper tree where he'd tied her. She sensed his unease, or perhaps she heard the strange sound too. Animals always knew things before men. "Did we're going," he told her, stroking her dung-colored neck. "Following ghost sounds makes as much sense as anything else." Toka mounted with the fluid grace that had earned him his name, friend of the horse. The trail down from the mesa was treacherous, especially in the fading light, but he knew every stone and dip. His grandfather had taught him to read the land like white men read their books, to see paths where others saw only wilderness. That as they descended, the calling grew clearer. Not a flute after all, but something between a song and a cry. Human, yet not. It pulled at something deep in his chest, something connected to memories of his grandfather's weathered hands tracing symbols in sand, explaining the sacred language, written in stone and sky. The desert cooled rapidly as darkness fell. Stars emerged, brilliant and numerous, unconcerned with the tiny dramas playing out beneath them. Tokuda's people had navigated by those stars for generations. His grandfather had taught him their names, their stories. Now those same stars watched him follow a sound that might be madness. 3 hours of hard riding brought the distant lights of Redemption into view. Tokuda slowed, caution replacing curiosity. He hadn't been to the settlement in over a year. The last time a drunk prospector had tried to take his scalp as a souvenir, the man had lost 3 fingers instead, and Tokuda had been warned never to return. Yet the calling pulled him forward, insistent as a heartbeat. He left Epona hidden in a dry wash half a mile out and continued on foot. Better to come unnoticed. Better to have a swift retreat if needed. The rifle stayed with the horse, too conspicuous. Instead, he carried only his hunting knife and the small revolver tucked into his boot. His grandfather would have disapproved of the gun, but his grandfather hadn't lived to see how the world had changed. Redemption's main street lay quiet under the moon. A piano played something melancholy from the saloon, and yellow lamplight spilled from windows. Tokuda moved like a shadow between buildings, following the sound that seemed clearer now. A girl's voice, singing words he couldn't understand, led him to the edge of town, to a small cabin set apart from the others. No light showed in its windows, but smoke curled from the chimney. The singing stopped abruptly as he approached, replaced by silence so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. Crouched behind a stack of firewood, watching. Minutes passed. Then the cabin door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, with a preacher's collar. He scanned the darkness, hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Who's there?" the preacher called. "Show yourself or I'll shoot where you stand." Tokuda remained motionless, barely breathing. The man took a few steps forward, peering into the night. "If you've come for the girl again, you're wasting your time. She's under God's protection now." The girl. The voice on the wind. Tokuda felt a prickling across his skin, the same feeling that came before lightning struck. The preacher waited, listening. Finally he turned back toward the cabin, but paused at the threshold. "The good book says even demons tremble before the Lord," he said to the darkness. "Remember that." The door closed. Tokuda remained hidden, watching as a lamp was lit inside, casting the shadow of the preacher against a curtained window. And then another shadow, smaller, female. The silhouette of a girl, her head bowed, her hands outstretched as if seeking something she couldn't see. The wind shifted again. carrying her voice once more, not singing now, but speaking words that froze Dakota's blood in his veins, words in his grandfather's tongue, words no settler girl should know. And as her shadow turned, Dakota saw what the preacher had hidden: eye markings on the girl's arms, visible even through the curtain. 3 wavy lines intersected by a perfect circle, the same symbol carved into his own flesh. Chapter 2. Sacred Markston crept across redemption with reluctant fingers, painting the weathered buildings in shades of amber and gold. Dakota hadn't slept. He'd retreated to the hills after seeing the girl, his mind a storm of questions without answers. Now he watched the settlement stir to life from his perch among the rocks, a ghost observing the living. The preacher's cabin stood apart from the others, isolated by choice or circumstance. Dakota couldn't tell. Smoke rose from its chimney in a thin gray line, straight and unwavering in the still morning air. She was in there. The girl with his grandfather's markings, the girl who spoke words she shouldn't know. "What are you?" he whispered to the distance. Not who, but what, the question revealing how deeply the sight had shaken him. A movement caught his eye. The cabin door opened, and the preacher emerged, leading a slender figure by the arm. The girl, she moved with the careful steps of the blind, one hand slightly extended before her, the other gripping the preacher's elbow. Her hair fell in a dark curtain past her shoulders, and even from this distance, Dakota could see that her eyes were covered with a strip of cloth. But it was her arms that held his gaze. Bare below the elbows, they were marked with intricate patterns, not just his grandfather's symbol, but dozens of others. Symbols that belonged to his people, 2 ceremonies performed far from white men's eyes. Sacred things, private things, carved into pale skin. The preacher guided her to a bench beside the cabin and helped her sit. He spoke to her, his posture stiff with authority, then pointed a warning finger before striding toward the town center. Leaving her alone, Dakota moved before conscious thought formed, descending the hillside in a controlled slide, keeping to shadows and scrub brush. Part of him knew this was foolishness, approaching a white settlement in daylight, seeking out a girl claimed by a preacher. Men had been hanged for less, but the markings pulled him forward like a current. He circled wide around the settlement, approaching the cabin from behind where fewer eyes might spot him. The girl sat motionless on her bench, face tilted toward the rising sun, as if she could to feel its warmth even if she couldn't see its light. Her fingers traced patterns on her own arm, following the carved symbols with practiced precision. 20 yards away, Dakota paused behind a gnarled juniper. Speak to her in what language? He asked himself. English felt wrong for this moment, but his native tongue had grown rusty on his lips from disuse. The decision was made for him, when she suddenly turned her head in his direction. "Who stands in the shadows?" she asked in perfect English, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "You breathe like someone who knows how to disappear." Dakota froze. Her blindness was real. The cloth covered her eyes completely, yet she had sensed him with uncanny precision. "I won't call for help," she continued when he didn't answer. "The Reverend won't return until midday. He has souls to save in town." A hint of bitterness colored these last words. Still, Dakota hesitated. Then she raised her arm, tracing the circle and wave symbol with one finger. "You carry this mark too. I heard your surprise last night. I heard your recognition." "How could you know that?" Dakota asked, finally stepping from behind the tree but keeping his distance. A smile touched her lips, sad, knowing the wind carries secrets to those who listen. "Those are my grandfather's symbols," he said, moving closer despite his caution. "Sacred things, not for others to wear. Not given willingly," she replied, pulling up her sleeve to reveal more markings climbing toward her shoulder. "Carved while I slept. A new one each time the Reverend thinks I've sinned." Cold anger settled in Dakota's chest. He'd seen such things before, white men taking pieces of his culture as trophies or curiosities. But this was different. More deliberate. More perverse. "What does he gain from this?" Dakota asked, now standing directly before her. "Power," she said simply. "He believes these marks trap evil spirits. That I was born touched by the devil because I cannot see. Each symbol is meant to bind another demon." She extended her hand into the space between them. "My name is Sarah, though he calls me Magdalene when he's angry after the woman of sin in his Bible." Dakota didn't take her hand. Touch was a language, with its own consequences. Instead, he crouched before her, studying the markings more closely. Some he recognized: protection symbols, healing signs, markers of the seasons. Others were unknown to him, perhaps invented by the preacher or borrowed from half-remembered illustrations in books about Indian savagery. "These symbols aren't evil," he said finally. "They're stories, maps, ways to remember." "I know," she whispered. "They speak to me sometimes in dreams. That's why he keeps adding more. He thinks I'm possessed when I repeat what they tell me." A shout from the direction of town made Dakota tense, ready to flee. But it was unrelated to them, just settlers beginning their day's labor. "Why are you here?" Sarah asked, her head tilted in that peculiar way of the blind, as if listening to something beyond ordinary hearing. "The wind," Dakota answered truthfully. "It carried your voice. You were singing in my grandfather's language." Her fingers found her throat. "I don't know any songs but hymns." "You sang word to the Great Circle ceremony." Words about returning to the earth what was taken. Sarah's expression changed, fear replacing curiosity. He'll kill you if he finds you. Here he says the devil sends Indians to claim me. Why does he keep you? Tokuda asked, even as he recognized the need to leave soon. I see things, she said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. Not with my eyes, but I see things lost, things hidden. Her hand rose, hovering inches from Tokuda's face, like the scar above your eye from your father's fist. Like the pouch of tobacco you still carry though your grandfather is for summers in the ground. Tokuda pulled back sharply. No one could know that. The marks tell me, she said. That's why he keeps carving them, that's why he keeps me. I am his proof that devils exist, and that he alone can control them. Chapter 3. The price of knowing. 3 days passed like shadows over stone. Tokuda watched the preacher's cabin from hidden places a ridge beyond town, the abandoned mine shaft, the tall grass behind the livery. He watched as the reverend led Sarah to Sunday service, her arms covered by long sleeves despite the heat, her blindfolded face turned downward as townsfolk whispered. He watched as the preacher locked her inside each morning before walking to town, key turning with deliberate ceremony. On the third night, Tokuda dreamed of his grandfather, not the frail man who had died coughing blood into a government blanket, but the warrior who had once led their band straight-backed and clear-eyed, voice like thunder rolling across the plains. The marks are a language, his grandfather said. In the dream, tracing symbols in fire, not meant for flesh. Tokuda woke with the taste of ash in his mouth, decision already formed. He would take the girl away from the preacher tonight. Clouds had swallowed the moon and stars. Perfect darkness for what he intended. Tokuda moved through redemption like water, finding cracks in stone silent, persistent, invisible. The cabin stood dark and still. No lamp burned inside. The only sound was the distant piano from the saloon, and a soft whisper of wind through sage. The lock on the door surrendered to his knife with surprising easement to keep someone in, not others out. Tokuda slipped inside, senses alert for any movement. The cabin's interior smelled of tallow candles and fire, a scent he recognized from years of being hunted. A small fire smoldered in the hearth, casting just enough light to navigate the sparse furnishings. Sarah sat in a straight-back chair facing the door, as if she'd been waiting for him. Her blindfold was gone. In its place, Tokuda saw what the cloth had hidden, not blindness as he'd understood it, but something else entirely. Where eyes should have been were intricate patterns of raised scars, forming the same symbols that marked her arms. He took them, she said softly, fingers hovering near but not touching the ruined flesh. When I was 7, said eyes were windows. Demons could enter through. Tokuda's stomach twisted with revulsion and rage. He'd seen cruelty before, had survived the soldiers' knives and guns, but this was different. This was slow, deliberate. Sacred symbols perverted into instruments of torture. I've come to take you from here, he said, the words thick in his throat. I know, she replied. I've been waiting. He's gone to Tucson for 3 days. There won't be another chance. How can you know these things? Tokuda asked, still keeping his distance. Unsure if her power was something to fear. Sarah's scarred face turned toward the dying fire. The marks speak, not in words, but in knowing. Each one is like. She paused, searching for explanation. Like a finger touching a different part of the world, I feel what they touch. She stood, moving with the confidence of someone who had memorized every inch of their prison. From beneath her bed, she withdrew a small bundle wrapped in faded gingham. All I need, she said, clutching it to her chest. The rest belongs to him. Where will we go? Tokuda asked, realizing only as the words left his mouth that he had no plan beyond this moment. North, she answered without hesitation. To the place where the stones stand like men and water runs beneath the earth. The place your grandfather called TSB in Diziska, Monument Valley, a sacred place to his people, a place he hadn't visited since childhood. How do you the symbols? She interrupted, touching the marks on her arm. They carry memories. Your grandfather's memories, carved into me. A chill ran through Tokuda that had nothing to do with the night air. What had the preacher done? What power had he stumbled upon in his ignorant cruelty? We'll need horses, he said, pushing questions aside. Food, water. There are 2 horses in the small corral behind Weaver's place, she said. The bay mare and the black gelding. Weaver owes a debt to the reverend he'll never pay. The debt collector comes tomorrow. Tokuda studied her face, searching for deception and finding none. You've planned this every day for 6 years, she replied, the hint of a smile touching her lips. Since the first mark was carved. Outside a dog barked once, then twice. Sarah tensed. Someone's coming, she whispered. Not the reverend. 2 men. They smell of whiskey and bad intentions. As if summoned by her words, heavy footsteps approached the cabin, accompanied by low, masculine laughter. Tokuda moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. 2 men staggered toward the cabin, one carrying a bottle, the other a lantern that cast wild shadows across the dirt. Reverend keeps that blind devil girl locked up tight, one slurred loudly. But Jenkins says he's gone to Tucson. Ain't right, the other replied. Man of God keeping such a creature, better to see if she's really touched by Satan. His laughter held no mirth, only the dull edge of cruelty sharpened by drink. Dakota turned to Sarah, who stood perfectly still, her bundle clutched to her chest. "Is there another way out?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Only the chimney, and it's too narrow." The footsteps stopped at the door. A heavy fist pounded against the wood. "Open up, devil girl," a voice called. "We've come to save your soul." Chapter 4. What the wind carries, get behind me, Dakota whispered, drawing his knife. Sarah moved without hesitation, her fingers brushing the back of his arm as she positioned herself in his shadow. The pounding grew more insistent. Wood splintered as a boot crashed against the lock. "We take neither path they expect," Sarah murmured, her breath warm against his shoulder. "Not surrender, not fight." Before Dakota could question her meaning, she began to sing the same haunting melody that had first called him across the desert, but now her voice carried power, each note vibrating with something ancient, the same language his grandfather had spoken in ceremony. The words of summoning, of movement between worlds. The door burst open. 2 men stumbled in, faces flushed with whiskey and intention. They froze at the sight before them, Dakota standing, tall, knife gleaming in firelight, and behind him Sarah, her ruined eyes uncovered, singing words that seemed to bend the shadows of the room. "What the hell?" the taller man began, hand dropping to his pistol. Sarah's song rose in pitch. The fire in the hearth suddenly flared, casting monstrous shadows across the walls. In that moment of distraction, Dakota moved not men but toward the window behind them. His hand found Sarah's, pulling her with him as he crashed through the glass in a shower of splinters and shards. They hit the ground rolling. A shot rang out behind them, the bullet splintering with where they had stood seconds before. Dakota pulled Sarah to her feet, and together they ran into the darkness, not toward town, but away from it, toward the desert that waited beyond like a silent ally there following. Sarah gasped as they ran, her feet somehow finding purchase on the uneven ground despite her blindness. "Weaver's horses," Dakota reminded her, changing direction slightly. They reached the small corral behind a weathered house Sarah had described. Just as she'd said, 2 horses stood in the moonlight, bay mare and a black gelding, already saddled as if waiting. "How did you know?" Dakota asked as he helped her mount the mare. "The symbols see paths before they're walked," she replied, hands finding the reins with practiced ease. "Some futures leave deeper tracks than others." Behind them, shouts broke the night's stillness, more men joining the pursuit. Dakota swung onto the gelding, and they rode hard toward the open desert, the horses' hooves kicking up dust that glowed silver in the moonlight. They rode through the night, guided by stars and Sarah's uncanny sense of direction. By dawn they had crossed 20 miles of desert, leaving redemption far behind. They rested briefly in the shelter of a sandstone overhang, sharing jerky and water from Dakota's supplies. "Will they follow this far?" he asked, scanning the horizon they'd left behind. Sarah pressed her palm against the red stone. "No. The preacher will return early as business concluded faster than expected. His rage will consume the men who entered his sanctuary. They'll pay the price for our escape." Dakota studied her face in the dawn light, the intricate patterns where her eyes should have been, the strength in her jawline, the peace that seemed to settle over her features now that they were free of the cabin's confines. "The symbols," he said finally. "My grandfather never explained what they truly meant, only that they were sacred." Sarah's fingers traced the marks on her arm. "Their memory," she said simply. "Your people didn't write with letters like the whites. They wrote with these symbols, stories, wisdom, maps to sacred places. Your grandfather was a keeper of these marks, and now they're carved into your flesh." "The preacher thought he was binding demons," she said with a bitter smile. "Instead, he was giving me the collected wisdom of your ancestors. Each mark connects to a different knowledge, a different power. Can they be removed?" Dakota asked, thinking of the pain she must have endured. Sarah shook her head. "They're part of me now, as much mine as yours." She reached out, her fingers finding his face with unerring accuracy, tracing the line of his jaw. "But I would learn their proper meaning, their true purpose. Will you teach me?" Something shifted in Dakota's chest, a weight he'd carried since his grandfather's death, the burden of being the last to know the old ways. But here was someone who could share that burden, someone who carried the symbols in her very flesh. "Yes," he said. "Though I only know what my grandfather taught me, it will be enough," she replied. "And what I don't learn from you, the symbols themselves will teach me. In time." They mounted again as the sun climbed higher, heading north toward Monument Valley. As they rode, Dakota found himself watching Sarah, the way she sat tall in the saddle despite never having ridden before this night. The way she tilted her head to listen to the desert's subtle voices, the way the wind played with her hair like an old friend. "My grandfather believed all things carried messages," he said as they rode side by side across a dry wash. "The flight of birds, the shape of clouds, the sound of wind through canyon walls. What message brought you to me?" She asked. Takod considered this, watching a hawk circle overhead in the endless blue. "That some wounds are meant to be witnessed, some burdens shared." Sarah smiled, her first true smile since he'd found her. and some paths must be walked together, even when they begin in different worlds. The desert stretched before them, harsh and beautiful. Behind them, dust rose from their passage, briefly suspended in the morning light before settling back to earth like memories returning home, like stories finding their proper place in the telling.